Hello, I hope, can you let me know if you can hear me? Okay, so for like all three of you, I think, two or three of you that are in here, tonight I thought that we would maybe dive in a little bit further because we were talking about the DCS complaint the other night, and I kind of did some broad strokes on that, and thought maybe we could try to dive into it a little bit more, like, because there's, like I mentioned the other day, a lot of people think that this is kind of, basically Seth against the world, and it's actually two complaints. Or two plaintiffs, I'm sorry. It's Seth and Sebastian against DCS, and then the other one is Seth and Sebastian against Sumner County. So, with all of the acronyms and all the programs, I mean, I was overwhelmed with it. Of course, I have my spreadsheet that has all this stuff listed, but I thought maybe we could just kind of run through, um, what the claims actually are in this to get a better understanding, because we did see such horrifying and horrific and details that we should not have read. Quite honestly, I would think that a judge would probably look at some of the things that were detailed in that complaint and say, why am I reading this? Because it really, and I'll give you some more information as I'm going through this, and you'll understand, hopefully understand a little bit more, because I had to really process that as well. Like, what am I reading? Because what we do see really, really shocks the system. And, so it's hard when you see things like that, it's really hard to discern, like, are we this is not a criminal case against, Chris. It's not against Katie. We're not trying to decide, who's responsible for his disappearance. None of us know. And, he could have run away. He could have been lured out. We don't know. Um, but yeah, Shauna, yeah. So when you have an attorney that's out of state, unless they're admitted to the bar, like in different states, which some of them are, they're multi-state. What they do is, he can file the complaint. He can actually be like the lead counsel on that. But what he would need to do, because even though it's a federal case, so you think federal, like, America wide, we think this is, if it's federal, it's got to be, all the way across the United States, right? So, but that doesn't necessarily mean that an attorney can, even though it's a federal claim, they can't just practice in any state just because it's at the federal level. That's not like a blanket type of claim or case. So what, even though he can be lead counsel in there, what they want is somebody to be a local attorney. So, and it's basically kind of like, almost like they want somebody to know what the local procedures are. Even though it's federal, there's federal rules, there's federal guidelines, there's federal procedures, but there's also local. So if you think of it like this, so the what they want a local attorney for is basically so that they know and they can guide this dude, um, Richie, so that they can guide him and make sure that he's hitting all the marks. They want to make sure that that he understands what the courthouse guidelines are, what the federal guidelines are, what the local rules are, and that might be like, double spacing in this document, but not in that document, and you have to use Times New Roman, which I hate so much. But you might, it just like all of those little intricate rules that somebody from California wouldn't know about Tennessee. And if you think of it like this, like the football, like the NFL. The NFL, all those teams play by the same rules, but when they go into, like, when they go to Detroit, if they go to Chicago, when they go into those stadiums, there's a unique set of rules for each stadium. So that's kind of a different, hopefully an easier way to understand it. That's the way I kind of, remember it. It's like, because you have so many different guidelines that sometimes it gets confusing, and it's really hard to even remember when you're even writing a complaint. You have to remember to go and look at all the varying kinds of local rules, and the state rules and the federal, and so it can get messy. And that's why they want somebody there on the ground close by. And then also, if he's in California, if there was something ever urgent that needed to come up and they needed somebody to be in that courthouse, hopefully there's going to be somebody down the street that can do that. So that's the longer version of, I don't mean to confuse you or didn't mean to ramble on, but I was just trying to explain, because I think some people would just think like, well, he's not licensed to practice in Tennessee, so he can't be there, so the judge is going to throw us out. It's just not it. So, okay, so I think let's kind of start out, since I am new to this, you're going to have to bear with me on, yeah. With everything going on and the craziness, and then you have your allegiances, amongst law enforcement with attorneys and whatnot. It may be hard to find somebody, but it might be more so of, if it's just procedural and they need somebody to push the papers through or deliver something to the courthouse, they may be able to find somebody to do that. That person may never even have to speak in court. Okay, so let's kind of start with a little, I'll just do a quick background on me. And, I am, again, I'm not an attorney. I do have a legal background. This is not legal advice. I'm working from public documents just like everyone else. And public statements, I'm not questioning whether Sebastian experienced trauma or suggesting that a child should not be believed when he discloses something. And I think that's kind of hard for us to read because, we read these things and we think, was that enough for DCS to show up there? But we don't really know what all those conversations were yet, right? Because, they just threw all these allegations into this complaint, and not very well, mind you, but they threw them in there. And then we're looking at this like, where's the other 2 DCS reports? There's supposed to be 5, and where's all these details? And those things will just start rolling out probably in a couple months when they start. And they may seal it because this attorney decided to put so many details into this complaint that is gross. So we may not even see any documents moving forward unless they unseal them or just kind of individually let them be shown. But as long as these reports or as long as this complaint looks the way it does, I don't think that we'll see it on the street. And for Sebastian's dignity, I think that that's a good idea. So, okay, let's see here. Yeah, I just want to explain like who I am, and I just want to make sure everybody knows that this is not legal advice. I'm not saying this is, I'm doing my own research as well. I'm learning as I go. I don't deal with federal. I haven't dealt with federal that much, so some of those things you just have to like, oh yeah, I heard that before, but where did I hear that? And then I got to go digging. So. What I am questioning is the way this lawsuit has been pleaded and why we have private details that should not be included, as they have no bearing on the case itself, and why we are hearing that there are 5 CPS reports, but we are only hearing about 2, plus the one that was opened after he disappeared. So the complaint asks us to believe that DCS missed critical information because DCS allegedly didn't speak with Seth during the May 2023 investigation. So that's what he claims later in the complaint, but as we know, earlier in that complaint we read that yes, they did have a conversation with him. So but interestingly enough, and I don't know who has the complaint, I do have one that's like majorly redacted, if anybody wants it, but I will not show it or send it or give a copy to anybody as long as it has those details in there that we should not be seeing. I do have it redacted if anybody wants it. But for anybody who has it, or if you find it somewhere, there is, like paragraphs 50 through 52 also tell us that Seth already possessed the information. So he knew about fear, ridicule, worsening behavior, distress, Katie's frustration. He told us that in his own complaint. So even though tonight's uncomfortable but necessary, the question is if Seth already knew all of those things. Why does the complaint describe him almost like a locked filing cabinet that only DCS had the key to? So, parents do not generally need to wait for a government caseworker to ask the perfect question before they act on information they believe shows their child is unsafe. So that doesn't automatically excuse DCS. It does not automatically defeat Seth's case, but it absolutely belongs in the conversation about knowledge, causation, credibility, responsibility. So tonight I kind of want to just talk about, hopefully we'll get through, like about 5 things. I'll try to explain the actual civil rights questions and walk through the 2 investigations that they did do. Remind us a little bit about what Tony Mathis claimed publicly, because they had their whole schedule that Tony rambled off on Mr. E's Crimecast. There was all of these things that they knew was happening, and a lot of discussions about, Sebastian's behavior and the frustrations and going to live with Seth. And, amazingly enough, that stuff didn't show up in the complaint. Also, there was one thing that Tony said that really resonates with me. It just kind of hit me, actually, the wrong way once I read the complaint, and then when I listened to it again, he said, keep in mind that not all of the complaints are necessarily towards, which he was talking about Chris, and he said it could be maybe the mother for basically allowing it to happen. And I'm thinking, what about the dad for, letting it happen? If we're going to balance out this board, then let's balance out this board, right? So, the subject is serious, but the writing can still be questioned. So, let's, strip away some of the dramatic language for a minute and, get a little explanation here. A civil rights complaint is not graded on how alarming it sounds. The court has to connect particular facts to a particular legal requirement. So the first big rule comes from a United States Supreme Court case called DeShaney, and they quote that in there. That case is especially important because it also involved the Child Welfare Agency that knew about suspected abuse, and they didn't remove the child before harm occurred. So the general rule is harsh, but it's important. So the Constitution usually does not require the government to protect a person from harm caused by another private person. So does that mean DCS can never be liable? It means that saying DCS should have done more is not by itself the complete formula for a federal constitutional claim. So if you kind of think of it this way, there are like 3 separate boxes. One was the investigator poor, incomplete, or contrary to, the investigation. Was it, like incomplete, contrary to policy? Was it poorly done? That's in one box. Then we got another box is was somebody negligent under state law? And in the third box, did a state official violate a right protected by the United States Constitution? Now, think about what I just read. So, those boxes can overlap, but they are not interchangeable. And a bad decision does not automatically become a constitutional violation just because the consequences may have been serious. So for a state-created danger theory, the judge is likely to ask questions such as, what affirmative action did the DCS defendant take that created a new danger or made an existing danger worse? And I think that's what we keep reading in that, is they keep saying, that there was like an affirmative action that caused him to disappear. It's almost like that's where they're trying to lead. And that is not, that's what the court needs to kind of look at. Once they get past all of the details in there that he's probably not going to want to see, then he has to try to sort that out and figure out what is the question, Is the complaint describing an affirmative act, or mostly a failure to investigate, a failure to interview, a failure to remove, and a decision to close a case? Was Sebastian placed at a special risk different from the public generally? Did each individual defendant know enough to consciously disregard a serious risk? So, is there a plausible connection between specific DCS conduct in 2022 or May 2023, and Sebastian's disappearance in February of 2024. Now, I've been looking through their policies and procedures, and they have changed. They have tweaked their, they've kind of made some changes to the policies. They have some some different ways of filtering, the sense of urgency. Like Sebastian's case was labeled as a priority 3. And actually, in both calls, they labeled it as a priority 3, which was kind of the bottom, which means they have, I believe it's 3 days to 3 business days to contact all the parties and get the investigation going. They start but they have to meet with the parties, I think within 3 days. But they have since eliminated that, so now they only have 1 and 2. They have your priority 1 and 2. So his was 3. That's non-existent, but I think that's probably mostly because it was already done. Like it was a case that had already been, asked and answered for the most part. It was child on child. It was out of state. It was already, it was already, obviously from what Sebastian was telling whomever he was speaking with, and then we later found out that Seth was speaking to the SRO. They clearly know that this happened out of state. It was years ago, so that may be why it went to a priority 3. I don't know for sure, but the complaint just repeatedly calls the defendant's conduct affirmative, but calling an omission an affirmative act doesn't necessarily make it one. So, like if I forget to lock the door, I failed to act. If I unlock the door for a known attacker, that is an affirmative act. So, yeah, you're right. Out of Tennessee jurisdiction. And we should not know that child's name. I mean, I'm still brewing about it. So the legal argument has to identify which kind of conduct we're actually dealing with, not merely attach words. Like when they wrote this complaint, there was a lot of things in there that were, they just inferred. But like I said, thankfully allegations are not findings, and they can sort all that out later. I think that it would be less confusing if they would have at least put in some policies, at least referenced. I mean, they had no problem putting in quotes like what DCS said and did and didn't do, and what other people were saying, but they didn't put any reference to any of the DCS policies in there. So that would have been helpful for us to say, oh yeah, here's their procedures. This is what they were supposed to do, and this is what they did, and they missed the mark on this. And then there's also the question, but is it enough to cause Sebastian to disappear? So then there's, so we have, Sebastian, the complaint also alleges the quote-unquote special relationship. So in plain language, that theory usually becomes stronger when the government has taken control over someone's ability to protect themselves. But, like if a person's in state custody. But Sebastian was with his family, so the judge may ask whether investigating a family and having legal authority to remove a child is enough to create a special constitutional duty. So, this is just some of the things that they have in there. Authority to act in custody over a person are not necessarily the same thing. And that's kind of, I think, where that Title 4E comes in a little bit. Then there's Seth's parental rights claims. Now, parents have an important liberty interest in the care, custody, and companionship of their children, but the court still has to ask, what did these defendants actually do to interfere with Seth's relationship with Sebastian? I mean, it's a question, because that's what he's claiming. So, was there a government restriction? Was there a removal? Was there an order or direct interference? Or is the claim that DCS didn't notify or interview him? Is that enough? So, again, something can be unfair and contrary to policy or just frustrating, but it doesn't necessarily satisfy every element of a federal constitutional claim. So, I have some questions here. These are practical legal questions. Can DCS itself be sued for damages under Section 1983, or does state sovereign immunity block that claim? So these are some of the things, this has nothing to do with what actually happened to Sebastian in these DCS claims, like his any injuries, or, this is actually, the complaint is very convoluted with all those details. So, these complaints are actually at a much higher level, and they're really not even addressing what happened to the child himself. So, does the complaint identify what each defendant personally knew and what they personally did? Are the individual employees protected by qualified immunity because the exact constitutional duty was not clearly established? So that would be like, in a school, if the kids are told the rule is we don't throw a ball in the hallway, and that's the rule that we knew, and a teacher throws a ball in the hallway and it hits a kid and it hurts them. That's one thing. It's like, is the teacher really negligent for breaking the rules, or did the principal say, yeah, you can just throw it once? I mean, those are the kind of the hills and valleys that they're going to go through with this. So, I mean, none of the questions really answer who's morally right. They answer whether a particular complaint states these particular claims against these particular defendants, and they have a list of them. So, so before we go into investigations, let's make it, I guess the defendant list a little less intimidating. And I guess I just kind of gave you an analogy too, but imagine a school, a child is hurt, and this is kind of what Seth is doing. If a child is hurt and a lawsuit names the school district, the superintendent and her official role, the principal personally, the teacher, and unnamed employees whose identities are not known yet. We are very familiar, even with the RICO, you got the does 1 through 50 or 1 through 100 or what number you want to pick, So they always throw that in there because they're just like, oh, we don't know who we want to blame yet. So, those are not 5 different ways of saying the same thing. So, the agency claim is aimed at DCS as a government body, and the official capacity claim against the commissioner is generally another way of reaching to the government office, especially if they want to order, that requires for further actions. And he did that. He wants to open those claims back up. So it's basically like whoever occupies the superintendent's chair needs to make a district follow this order, I mean, he's really making this very broad and wide. And I think that's where it becomes so confusing, because we're looking at all these intimate details about this poor kid and what happened to him. And then, then when you start looking at the actual claims, it doesn't justify, what Sebastian actually went through, and we're not even really talking about that. So, I mean, if you think of a restaurant, if your meal is wrong, you can't simply sue the regional manager personally because she has the fanciest title. You'd need a legal reason to make her responsible for what she personally did, and if a server brings you the wrong dinner, you don't go and sue corporate because you got the wrong meal, they typed in the wrong number. So, the judge is going to ask, all of these people, did Boswell personally learn in her interviews what did she personally fail to do? And Richie, the same thing. What did she personally make, what did she personally approve? And, we have all of these people in here. And so the last qualified immunity is like everyday language. It's not a magical government employee wins card. It takes, it asks whether the official allegedly violated a constitutional right, but they have to dig into those policies and see, were they following them? Even if the policies are not up to snuff, and I know that they've been updating theirs because they do have some audit reports where they're not that great. So they have been updating them, but if one of those employees are following protocol, and there were a lot of people involved. I mean, this is not like, one lady got the call, looked at it and said, I'm going to go talk to these people. Oh, there's really nothing going on. I mean, there was a whole host of people, and, there was teams, and, there's a lot of people involved in this, and it just kept going down and filtering down the line. And they got to the point where they're like, even when they knew it was out of state, aside from, what they were claiming about Chris, Sebastian having fear, I don't know how that all fit into that, but, even though they knew that this was more of a procedural and administrative type process that they were going through. I mean, this thing hung out for a couple months, and it took them a while to actually close that out. So the other night I mentioned that we have the Title 4E. Let's see if I can get this here. So, I thought I had a slide up here, sorry. The Title 4E candidacy, that, and I still don't know if I'm right, but that, I believe, that's the one thing that people are really talking a lot about. And I even heard it on some other channels, before I even read or heard the whole complaint read. I was hearing about this Title 4E, and it was definitely implied, and definitely it was more, I guess they were kind of accusatory, saying that Sebastian was actually a candidate to be removed from the home and put in non-custodial care, like in foster care. And when I heard it, there's a couple people I heard say, well, I knew about this. And I thought, well, I don't know how you knew about this, because supposedly nobody has these reports, right? But when when I was thinking about it a little bit more, and I mentioned it the other night, was the first call to the hotline was September 28th, and this Title 4E candidacy was put in place on the 29th, and that was before they even met, went to the house and met with Chris and Katie and Sebastian, and then ultimately Seth whenever they talked to him. And so I thought, I want to look into that to see what that actually means. And so I did find some information. And so what is a Title 4E? Title 4E is a federal child welfare funding program. The foster care candidate is generally a child who remains outside state custody but is considered at serious risk or imminent risk of removal while the agency is attempting to prevent removal through reasonable efforts and services or actively pursuing removal. So I wondered, and I still wonder, if they put this in as a preventative measure. Like if we walk in there and it's chaos in that house and the kid has bruises on him, at least we have this in place, and we know that we can take him somewhere and we're going to get the federal funding match that we need, to be able to take care of him if something is actually going on. But there's a lot of questions that they ask, and a lot of this actually is funding for services. So the way it was actually presented kind of in the complaint, and the way it was presented for the first few days that this complaint was out, was kind of like, well, this Title 4E, that means, there was something bad going on, and, he was a candidate for being removed and put in foster care. And they didn't do it. And that's not really the way it is. So, it's actually, it provides funding to, to get resources for the kids. So if they would have walked in there and Katie said, I have no idea, he's got, this disorder and this disorder and this disorder, and, we just moved here and I'm trying to find programs, and if they didn't have the financial means or the insurance or whatever to be able to get into those programs, then this program, this Title 4E, would actually be able to help them do that. So it is a little bit broader than taking a child out of the home. It is for emergency placement, but it's also for, getting them into programs. So, in the complaint, it alleges that the Title 4E candidacy was first recorded on September 29, 2022. But what's interesting is when that call went in May of 23, that Title 4 candidacy was actually removed before they even went to the house, which I found was interesting. And it could be wrong because we've seen some crazy stuff in these complaints, so it could be wrong. I don't know. Um, and then it says that, the September 2022 record contained a non-custodial placement need, and that's not necessarily that's the way they wrote it, but that's not really what it was. They didn't know. They didn't go there and then say, "Oh, there's a need, but we're just going to leave you here. Sorry, Sebastian. Call us if you need anything." They didn't do that. They had this in place, and I believe it was precautionary. So, considering that, I think because there was SA involved, and they heard that it was California, and they probably needed to verify everything. And when there's SA, they're on notice. They are toes on the ground. They should be prepared to take a child out of the house. But what's interesting is they put this in place, but they also only had them at a priority 3. So that's kind of conflicting. But it could also be the way that it's written in the complaint that skews our thoughts on that. It may have been precautionary in the sense that DCS was identifying a child in a case for possible prevention, case management, or pre-placement. And as we know that, Seth wants answers as to why they didn't talk to him and basically give him the option of being able to, take Sebastian if there was a need for placement while they were investigating. Well, I think what we've learned is that they were investigating a complaint or, a case from, a couple of years or 3 or 4 years prior. And I think that we may be able to consider the fact that maybe it was bothering Seth a little bit more than it was bothering Sebastian. So, it was March 1st when that candidacy appears again after Sebastian disappears. So, but they took that right out of the equation, before they even went and talked to him the second time. So, they will have to probably answer for that, like who entered it, what the specific criterion was that triggered that. Was there completed that FAST, assessment done? So they'll have to go through all of that, and what does non-custodial placement mean? So they'll have to explain all that to the judge, and they might just say, hey, the simple answer might be, we just wanted to be ready if the boy needed us. Done. And they went there and they talked to him, and he said, I don't have any concerns. And Katie was more concerned about, why is this coming up again, which we talked about the other day. My theory on that is that, this just keeps getting brought up, and, and she did have a lot of things in place. She already told them, and they verified actually that she had, he was going to be in this program, that he was going to a private therapist 3 days a week, and then he was going, there was a whole host of doctors that he was seeing, and she gave them all of that information. She gave them all the California information. And, so they didn't even need that Title IV candidacy. But considering everything that was going on, I think this kind of still hung out for like 2 or 3 weeks. And it went through a few more people to, look at this case and make sure. They were solid in that. They were wanting to make sure that there was, that nothing was happening that was, it is possible that maybe Sebastian was not necessarily being forthright and honest with, his concerns about Chris, or, somebody mentioned that. Somebody brought that up, was it a leading question? How, who talked to him? How did that come about? When we were talking about, California, Seth was talking about California, we found out, we don't even know how that all came about. So, anyway, that, so the I always want to say that, the 4E candidacy, kind of comes from that FAST assessment, along the way too. So, I really don't think that was meant to be, that we are going to take the child. So, I mean, that's just not what I'm getting from it. Especially once I started looking at, the order in which everything kind of went down. I just don't think that was. All right, get back to my list here of what I was planning to do. So, see, where are we on time? 8:45. So, I don't know if I know I talked about this the other night. This is the whole outline of what Tony was saying. What his outline of how things went in order. And if you notice, the only two things that are highlighted on here are the only two things that are talked about in the complaint. So there's all of these other things going on there, and especially what's highlighted in red, or what's in red font. Those would be important things for a defense attorney to know. But I mean, a jury. These are things that, if these conversations were actually happening, I think that, there is an argument to, there's a lot of things that you knew, and, and all along we've kind of been saying, well, Seth is complaining about all these things. We know about these things. He knows about these things, and, he's talking about them, and he was supposed to go live with him, and then they were talking about the schools. And one thing that I caught the other day when Seth was talking, somebody asked him about those schools that he was looking into, and he said, I just thought it was a summer program. So he totally dismissed that they were having conversations about a residential program for Sebastian. And he's the one who actually went to a resource, some type of resource person to find, 4 options, I believe there was. And I looked them all up, and not one of them have actually only a summer program. They were, 3, 6, 12 months, years where troubled teens could go through their high school years. And, and it was a strict program. But now that this complaint is out, now he's saying, well, I thought that they were just talking about a summer program. So that kind of changed a little bit as well, which I thought, I'm just seeing a lot of cleanup, going on now that, these things are out there. And I don't know if his attorney just didn't. Yep, got it, Shauna. Yep, he did. I actually have a little clip of that. I just snagged that clip the other day. He did tell Sebastian he was going to give him a year to fix his behavior. And, and just think about Sebastian. And when, all the things that he was going through. And if he was talking to, we don't even really know the truth behind these complaints. We don't know the truth behind the DCS reports. What we're seeing is not what Tony was talking about. There's all these conversations that he's insisting happened, and I'm assuming that this information came from Seth, right? So think about what Sebastian was going through. If he was indeed trying to report things that were happening, or if he was getting into trouble, what we did see is that this kid is kind of honest. I mean, that DCS worker showed up in May of 2023, and they had their, we heard that Chris said that he pushed him up against the wall when he made him mad, and then there was the lifting of the shirt. Sebastian, he made him lift his shirt, and he hit him in the stomach, or smacked him in the stomach, whatever it was. And, depending on which channel you're listening to, it could be a punch, it could be a sock, it could be a tap, it could be a smack. We don't know what thought process people are getting to with this complaint. But when I heard that he hit Sebastian in the stomach, and then I actually read the complaint, I just got this vision, and all of them described it the same way. He just smacked him with the back of his hand on his stomach, and you can just hear that thud, that sound of, just like that emptiness, that sound when somebody smacks you in the belly. But Sebastian keeps saying that he has no fears, he has no concerns, and I noticed that like these complaints, there's two elements in each one, and they don't jive. We have the essay in California with, oh my gosh, corporal punishment from Chris. And then the second one is Chris said that he pushed Sebastian up against the wall and he makes him mad. And then Sebastian said that he hit him in the stomach because he wasn't wearing a belt. Those don't match because we have Chris saying something about himself, supposedly, but then we have Sebastian, something happened to Sebastian. Well, who reported that to know what Chris said, and who reported that to know what Chris did to Sebastian? They just don't match, and in both those cases, the two things that DCS wants to talk about, they don't match by who would actually be the reporter. I mean, it just doesn't click with me. Like because usually it's like if something happens, well, yeah, I know. I've been hearing that as Tennessee still allows corporal punishment. The world might be a better place. So I'm not into. I don't think that kids should be abused or beat, but sometimes they just kind of need a little reminder and a little bit more than I'm taking your iPad. So, I mean, my kids and I made contact like once a year. It's probably for shock value. That was when they like sent me right over the edge, and it was just enough. But what I also noticed too is in this. Remember when Chris was on Nancy Grace and he made the announcement of what he did, and because Sebastian wasn't wearing a belt, that he whacked him on the butt with a belt. That's not in this complaint. And Chris talked about it himself on Nancy Grace of all things, but it didn't surface in this complaint. So it seems to be there's a lot of cherry picking going on here. So I'm really curious to know what we're still missing. What is, yeah, Medea. So, so we have this list of what, let me just give you a reminder of what Mr. Rogers had said that he would have told DCS had they talked to him in May. I have it somewhere here. Well, I have it. I just got to find which paragraph. Oh, I've already said it like 5 times, and I'm acting like I don't know where it is. Paragraph 50. Had DCS fulfilled the most basic obligation, it would have learned critical information that was never captured in the case file. Rogers would have told DCS investigators that Sebastian had expressed to him on multiple occasions that he was more comfortable with Rogers than Proudfoot, and Sebastian was afraid of Proudfoot because he believed Proudfoot would hurt him if he disclosed what had been happening, which we don't know what was happening. Obviously, if something was happening, by this statement here, Seth knew whatever it was. Rogers would have informed DCS that Proudfoot had ridiculed Sebastian about the prior assault, compounding his existing trauma. Rogers would have told DCS that Katie had spoken to him on multiple occasions in terms that evidenced her frustration with and hostility towards Sebastian, telling Rogers repeatedly how fed up she was with him for his ongoing issues, and the very same issues that the therapist had documented as a known consequence of his prior trauma. Now, we do know that his, the deletion, that causes some of the issues that they're talking about that he was wearing pull-ups for. Rogers would have advised DCS that Sebastian's mental state had been deteriorating, and it goes on and on about all of the responsibilities that DCS had to know about all of these things that was going on with Sebastian, but yet he was in counseling, 3 days a week. He was going to a neurologist. He had in-house counselors coming in, and nobody else was reporting anything. And Seth obviously spoke to his son, he said on a daily basis, and then he would take him every other weekend. But then in another breath, he says that he was taking him to counseling as well. So he had ample opportunity to ask questions himself. And if all of these things were supposedly going on, and he knew that he was just waiting for DCS to ask him about, why wasn't he talking to that counselor? Again, are we a victim or are we a volunteer? This isn't Jeopardy. You don't have to wait for an answer to ask a question. I'm so exhausted of hearing, I didn't know, they didn't tell me. As a parent, if you're going to the school and you're participating, and that's what caught me, like, within the first week of looking into this. If you're going to the school and you're a participating parent, and you know the schedule, and you are meeting the teachers, and you know what your child's issues are. I mean, I used to go into my kids' class and I'd be like, so have you noticed them doing this or that? Just, if you do, let me know. So unless you're wearing rose-colored glasses, which obviously they weren't, why wasn't he asking these questions? He knew that he had these issues. And he also knew that Sebastian was being a little offensive to other people at school. And I believe that was what started the conversation with the SRO, which led to the disclosure, not by Sebastian. I just don't think that it did. But again, I guess, some of the questions are why isn't Katie mentioned in this as knowing these things were going on? So if Seth knew that these things were going on and he wasn't living there, obviously Katie would have known that these things were going on, right? So where's the DCS reports for her for allowing this to happen? We're not seeing those. So it's just not adding up for me. And I'm not saying that Seth is, that things didn't happen to Sebastian. It's just the way that this complaint is written. I think they're really going to struggle with it. On its face, it probably looks like a cash grab. But really, he's claiming that he has all the reports and he has the therapy reports and things of that nature, but I don't know why this was that important to do, other than to maybe get some facts out there that were written in these reports, like these details that we shouldn't know. There's a reason why we weren't supposed to see the DCS reports as the public. So let's put them into a complaint, right? And then let's wait 2 or 3 days before we lock it down and, make sure that it's sealed. Cute. So, we could have read all of this. We probably could scale this thing down to, 15 paragraphs. But it just runs on and on and on, basically saying the same thing of, Seth didn't know. Well, Seth has an awful lot of information for not knowing anything. And he's saying he was waiting for DCS to ask him about it, basically. So I know I'm rambling and we're going to go over here, but there's a lot of information here that I just want to make sure that we at least understand, what this civil complaint is and what it isn't. And kind of like what that Title IV is, that so we are educated enough that if we hear, well, he should have been ripped out of that house, they have it in their report that he was, in imminent danger. No, that's not what it means. It didn't come after the interviews. It didn't, it's not like they went and met with Katie and they looked at this lady and they're like, holy cow, she's nuts. We're taking this kid, calling Madge to make sure that we get the Title IV put in place because I'm taking the child. That's not what happened. This was a preliminary. If they needed it, it was there, because if Seth told them all of the things that were happening with Sebastian, I'm sure that they had a whole host of issues. We don't know who called DCS. It was a school official, professional, they called it. But I think we know where the information most likely came from. And I also thought I thought about it afterwards too, is that he said that the SRO called in all 3 parents to the school, and he had a conversation with the SRO by himself, like off to the side privately. So that kind of puts in another layer of then why did this all happen? How did this happen where we have these 3 parents in the school, then all of a sudden this call goes in, and then we have 2 parents that are shocked that DCS is showing up at the house, and it's just like there's like too many confusing things, and I think that we kind of know what the root of it is, and just I know that Seth loves his son and he really wants him to. We all want him to be found, but um, I think that this is just his way of kind of pushing things out into the public, and considering that he was told that he is not to speak on those DHS or DCS reports after he leaked that, because of Tony being on TikTok, people know about these reports, and then they get a call right before they're going on Pascal to say, you're not supposed to be talking about these. So he's been sitting on them, and everybody's doing the backstroke saying, I don't have them. Yep. You don't have it, but that's why you knew that he was in imminent risk, right? So, I don't want to take too long. I know we had some hiccups in the beginning here. I have a lot more to go through, but it gets pretty thick. So it's, actually, the CPIT thing, that was, I think, one of the most important things that Seth really landed on, where he was trying to engage, make sure that everybody knew that Sumner County was actually engaged in this. And, so the CPIT actually is kind of a coordinated investigative team, and I think it just, mainly takes professionals from all different, from the detectives to, CPS to schools, and, so they kind of pick people from different elements of Sebastian's life, and they bring them together and say, this is what's happening with this child, so that they're not storing the same information in 5 different places or confusing. Everybody has the same information. So, yeah. Yeah, I saw that. Did you, they're all like, well, we don't have the reports. Yeah, smiley. Not Justin, not nobody. Not nobody? Okay. Okay, whatever. Yeah, it's kind of a fiasco. When you have a parent who is claiming, that to be Father of the Year, and then to hear him say, I don't, I believe in like holistic medicine, like medicine or whatever, and he didn't believe in, Sebastian being on this medicine. He just thought that they should just give him some coffee, and so it's like, well, that should be in the report actually. That would be a good thing to list in there. So, but yeah, I think I'll just kind of stop there. This is, I think that mainly I want people to know, that what was in here and what isn't in here, and this isn't a yeah, tea, yeah, yep, unless it's a chamomile. Yeah, I'm just kind of looking through my notes here to see, so like the FAST, that's what does it stand for? Family Advocacy, yeah, advocacy and support tool. That's just kind of almost like a decision tree type thing, it's just how it's not a lie detector. It's not, trying to figure out if somebody's guilty. It's just, that's just how they are collecting and doing their assessment on, the situation and whether or not the child's in danger. And there are different types of tools that they have, and I know that they're really upgrading. It was Seth. Oh, yeah, the DHS reports, or DCS reports behind a paywall. Yeah, so, FAST works in like an organizational way, It's not a lie detector test. It's not a criminal verdict. It's just proof, and it's not proof that, nothing bad ever happened. It's just, and it is only complete as the information gathered and entered. And, when they're going into their house and even Sebastian is saying, I don't have any concerns. And oh, by the way, I was lying about brushing my teeth. And oh, by the way, I was lying about making my bed. And, the kid just spewed everything that he was getting in trouble for. And he's like, I was lying about brushing my teeth and I got in trouble for it. So they have to take all that into account, because he's saying what he's getting into trouble for, but yet he's also saying that he's not in fear. And that doesn't mean that he wasn't. It does not mean that any of this is made up. It doesn't mean that he wasn't in fear of Chris. I have my personal opinions about that whole relationship and the dynamics there. And we definitely need to believe Sebastian, but Sebastian was not talking. We want to believe the child, but we're like, what is the child saying? You're not telling me in this complaint. What is he saying? Obviously, he's talking to Dad, bio Dad, because he has all of this information, but he wasn't telling it to DCS. So what is DCS supposed to do with that? If they talk to Seth, he offered up the information, in 2022 and didn't have any concerns, obviously. He didn't offer to take him. A month later, they had a conversation, Katie and Chris and Seth, supposedly per Tony, they had a conversation about him going to live with Seth. But, Seth was included, and he had ample opportunity multiple times a week to touch base with all of these adults in his life. So why do we have DCS in a vacuum over this? That's kind of my thing. But he may be afraid of Seth. And that's what, I think, isn't that what Robin said, was Seth's mom? Like, yeah, Sebastian told me what was happening, but he didn't want me to tell Seth because he was afraid of what Seth was going to do. That was one, I didn't hear it out of Robin's mouth, but it was one of the stories that was going around. And I thought, I don't know where your allegiance is, ma'am, and I don't think that it was until afterwards, and probably, with a little bit of guilt, that all of these things are coming to light. And now, Seth might be looking back to say, boy, I really should have, could have, would have, if, and I know Chai kind of knows my theory on this, is, if Seth was living, I don't know where he was living, was he living in California? And they helped him move to Tennessee so that he could be by his son. And it kind of, yep, should have reported it. But she's in another state, so I think that gets a little hairy, but still, where's your allegiance? I just think, did they, they had him full time, and obviously we're reading some of the things that were, he's a little mouthy. He was struggling in school per Seth. He's the one who talks about how he's struggling in school. So did they move him there to kind of give them a little bit of a break? Was the hope that he would take him more than just 4 nights a month, and especially when he was off work? Maybe it wouldn't have gotten so bad between, Sebastian and Chris or Katie or whoever, maybe it wouldn't have been so bad as they're portraying it here, with this poor relationship between Sebastian and Chris, if Seth would have stepped up and helped a little bit more. Maybe there wouldn't have been conversations about sending him to a residential school. And see, Summer Girl, that the thing about that is somebody went and got his work records, and we shouldn't know this, but here we are. I was actually looking for it today. but I remember looking at it and he was actually not working. So I think at one point he said, I think it was Chasing maybe that said, like if he would have him, and if he got called in, then he would go in, and Sebastian would stay by himself. But as a rule, and I remember Seth saying, on the weekends that I have my son, I don't work. So he had him on his off weekends, unless he got called in. But aside from that, Seth was off. Remember, the best one, I just heard it again today, from Tony, one of the replays of Jay's live with when Tony was on Brittany's panel. Seth was out looking for Sebastian every day for like the first 60 days until he couldn't walk because of his neck. And I'm thinking, is this dude walking on his... Is he doing cartwheels? Is he rolling? Why can't he walk because of his neck? It just threw me off a little bit. But he was off because if it wasn't the neck, it was the shoulder, and there's always... And once you pull up the report, his records, he barely worked. So I think, and I don't, this might not be fact, I'm trying to remember. I was trying to find it today because it's been so long since I saw it. I think that he may have still been in his probationary period when Sebastian disappeared, because he had been off for so long with his surgeries and whatnot, that I think they had to keep pushing his probationary period out. I think he did a little bit more training after he started. But yeah, I mean, I remember seeing those yeah. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I remember seeing those work records, and I thought, how, for one, now we know that he wasn't leaving him for 12 or 14 hours a night by himself. I mean, that's the good news of it. But why didn't he help Katie a little bit more? And I don't think for a minute, I don't know who's innocent and who's guilty. I'm not, I am not saying, that Katie's innocent. I'm not saying she's an angel. I'm not saying she's guilty. As parents, if he's a challenge, and we know he's a challenge, and if they moved him up there, maybe it was even unspoken, and maybe I'm even lying. I don't know, But I would think that maybe they were hoping that he would spend a little bit of time with them, and a little bit more. I mean, if you've seen him 4 days a week, or 4 nights a month, 4 nights a month, but he was off for 2 or 3 or 4 months at a time, why wasn't he going to pick him up a little bit more? Even if he took him, like on a Wednesday night, and give her, a night out with Chris, just to go to dinner or something. Because if he was in counseling 3 days a week, even though all of a sudden Seth is saying that he was taking him to counseling sometimes, he had a busy schedule. So she's trying to work. She's trying to hold down that fort, chase a snake around, keep track of Sebastian, all of those. She had no life. She... if she wasn't at work, it sounds like she was dealing with, doctors and counselors and whatnot. So if he was seeing this counselor three days a week, I'm assuming that wouldn't be during the day. It would have to be in the evening, or, even after school. So 3 days of Katie's week was with this counselor as well. She's got to, take him and wait, and it's probably an hour, and it was in Nashville, I believe, wasn't it? But I don't know. Seth was saying that, somebody was coming into the house a couple days a week. Hard to tell what the real story is here. But either way, if somebody's coming to your house 2 or 3 days a week, you're still, as a single parent, because Chris was working out of town, you're on the hook. So, it just, I don't know, that really bothers me, because, there's this, he was working all the time, he was leaving Sebastian by himself, and I'm like, not according to the records, and that makes me even more upset that she wasn't getting a break. If he's that, just maybe if he did run away, Look at all the things that were going on in his life. Look at the people that he had to deal with in his life and all the chaos. And he just wanted friends. But you can't have friends if you're in counseling 3 days a week, or if you got a potty mouth, maybe friends were kind of hard to come by. Um, but if he did run away, it's sad but true. Look at what he had going on. And if he wanted friends, what would it take for somebody to say, I'll be your friend? And here's a phone, by the way. What I don't understand on that theory is why they wouldn't just pick him up at school. Or, why wouldn't they, if they lured him out, or if he ran away, why didn't he do it on an easier day, like, you know, when he was at Seth's and he could walk out the door and basically be on the road, um, or he could walk out of school and get in a car. To leave in the middle of the night is a little unusual, especially with his capacities. To if he's ADHD, he's not going to remember where all the cameras are to be able to tuck and roll. Um, you know, so that's just kind of my take on it. I just think that we have this guy, who's complaining about the care that Sebastian was getting, but we don't see where he was supporting that care or supporting Katie. Um, and that's just my opinion on the whole thing, and I used to deal with that with my own, and I used to just say, you don't have to work with me, but don't work against me. And I think that that's kind of what Katie had going on here, especially if he was going to, give him coffee and tea instead of his medication. I think there was a lot going on. And I think that, this whole thing with these complaints are, last ditch effort, kind of a Hail Mary for Seth. He lost his friend, and his at night team, they fell off, and a lot of the channels fell off. So, he's got his new little set of groupies, but I don't think that they're really doing a lot to, they seem to be morally supportive of him. It says far school. Oh yeah, the school is too far. Yep. But I think that at least he's got himself surrounded with some, it does include Smiley and Bullhorn Betty, and they all have their unique characteristics. But I do think that Jen is good for him. I think that she can kind of keep him in check. I think that she may have inspired him to move away from some of the characters that he had surrounded himself with. So I'm not into the astrology thing. I don't, she does her astrology show and stuff, but I really think that her and her husband are good for him. And I think that they really kind of keep track and keep him grounded, and hopefully as long as they can keep him from mouthing off, then maybe he can kind of correct some of the chaos that's gone on. Some of the things that he said is just outrageous, and I think that that's why people, think that Seth is responsible for it, and not that they can really sort out why or discern why or even think of a plausible way of accomplishing it. It's just that he's been the loudest and he's been offensive, and I think that people blame him. And just because he has said some things that are so wild, and things that he says will come back and bite him. I can't tell you how many times I've heard, well, Seth said, and I'm thinking, well, Seth knows, he's just because he says things out of frustration, and coffee and tea are not going to resolve that. But when he says things out of frustration, I think that there's a lot of people who don't like him, to the point where they're like, yep, listen to what he said, listen to the way he's talking. And Chris was the same way. For the longest time, Seth was able to kind of slide through, it seemed, because Chris was the loudmouth. And then Chris kind of quieted it down a little bit, and then Seth got all angst about things and started mouthing off and just being offensive and saying things to people, and the pushing people away, and things of that nature. And then here come Tony, and then here comes At Night, and then all these creators, and and I just think that he lost himself somewhere along the way, and it just became about him and not about Sebastian anymore. And when you hear him over and over talk about how he doesn't know, and there's some very basic things that he should know. So anyway, I'm gonna let you guys go. I've just been rambling. I have a list of stuff that I still want to go through with you, but I think next, so we can kind of get away from some of this, at least now that we have an understanding what a civil or what the civil rights claim is and what it's not, is move on to Sumner County, because that one I'm still trying to cool off a little bit on. I might get a little mouthy on that one. Also might be fun. But I will save my, if I was a defense attorney, questions, I would ask Seth this list that I have prepared that I didn't go through. So, because I have a whole host of questions that I would ask him if I was even writing the interrogatories. I mean, I would just have so much fun with it, and not because this is a joke, but because what is written in here is just either offensive or unnecessary, and it just simply doesn't make sense. So anyway, thank you for hopping in here tonight and listening to me ramble. And I didn't, I wanted to kind of touch on some things. I don't want to go through too many things, otherwise we're going to lose it. But I at least want to make sure that we're clear on, where the responsibility was sitting, as far as DCS, and what some of these reports and investigations actually entailed, because the way that they describe them in the complaint is not the way it is. So 5 grown kids and 1 with disabilities, 2 with ADHD, and my husband worked all week out of town. Yep. Amazing. Yep. Super mom. Yeah, you're right. Nobody should have known about. Yeah. Well, I actually did the live stream on Sunday. I ended up not recording that. That live stream was on, I think it was Sunday. What's today? No, Saturday? What's today, Monday? Oh, yeah. Saturday, I think it was when I first did that first one, because I was trying to test out the sound and everything, and I would just touch a screen and my sound would go away, and I thought, I'm not doing those two things. Changing a screen visually does not, in my head, connect with you're going to lose your sound. So, anyway. So, yeah, I will probably, if I get enough time, I will pull together my thoughts on Sumner County. I do have a lot of it already. It's a matter of keeping my attitude in check and not offending anybody and not getting sued over it. So I might be able to pull that one off tomorrow. And I know Chai and I were going to go through soon. We're going to get into the trafficking. So we'll try to blend those in. Anyway, so thank you for hanging out with me and letting me practice on your ears. So, all right, everybody have a good night. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.